Hi everyone, this is Mr. Toh from ETG and I'm here to cover with you the 2022 H2 A-Level Economics case study paper, which is paper 1. Okay, right, before I start going through the answers for both case studies, I thought I'll do a bit of a summary, right, for my students on what I felt about the paper. Right, the paper should have been relatively manageable, right? That's because actually we covered the content for both papers, right, in our very last mock exam. Right, at ETG, right, we do 2 mock exams before the A-levels. The mock exam 1 and mock exam 2 are done in the 2 weeks before the A-levels. So 3 days before the A-level papers itself, we did mock exam number 2. Right, what are the mock exam papers are basically, I will set 2 mock exams which I think has a high chance of coming out for this year's A-levels based on my analysis of past year paper trends. Okay, so if you take a look at what we did on 12th November, right, we covered, right, 3 case studies, of which the very first case study, which was a case study I've set, right, I set a case study on electric vehicles, right, and in the same case study, I also covered the Australian bushfire, right. So quite amazingly, right, what we've covered in just this one case study came out for the 2 case studies, right, because I'm taking a look at the paper now. The first case study was about the Australian bushfire and the coronavirus pandemic. The second case study was about electric vehicles, right? So we've actually successfully predicted, right, most of the concepts that were tested as well. So let me just run through with you what we predicted would come out and what actually came out. So we predicted opportunity cost would came out. DDSS wasn't really exactly a prediction because DDSS comes out all the time. One of the questions, right, had contestable market as a reason that you could write. So that was something that we predicted as well. We have ADAS, we have conflict between macro objectives. And I think the 2 biggest concepts that we predicted that came out in a major way, right, was actually fiscal stimulus for COVID-19 pandemic. Right, that was in the context of Australia. And the last question of the second case study was a 10-mark question on comparative advantage. Actually, this is a concept called dynamic comparative advantage. We highlighted this to our students, right, in the final predictions lecture that we did in October, that dynamic comparative advantage would be having a high chance of coming out. So I think, right, if our students actually paid very close attention to mock exam number 2, and they also pay attention to the predictions that we have actually done, I think you all will do fine. Okay, so now let's go on and look at the answers now. Now I'm not going to flash the question paper due to copyright issues, so I can only go through kind of the answers instead of being I will not be actually showing you the question paper. We'll just go through the answers. Okay, so A1 and A2 are basically just standard supply and demand questions. So let's go through them. The first question, right, which is to talk about why price of fresh fruit and vegetables has gone up. So you talk about the drought. The drought is a weather factor that led to damage of vegetable and fruit crops, which will lead to supply falling. You can explain using a diagram why shift in supply to the left will lead to increase in price. Right, these are very easy questions, A1 and A2. You can just use the diagram, explain price adjustment process, you probably get it right. Okay, then A part 2, right, is asking about international tourist arrivals, why, you know, it will fall because of the bushfires. So the bushfires will actually lead to change in taste and preferences because people, tourists, they look at the bushfire, they will say, hey, you know, I don't want to be affected by the smoke or any fire that takes place when I come and visit. So that it will lead to fall in demand. Draw a diagram, show that there is a fall in output. So A1 is change in price, increase in price. A2, decrease in output. You can use the price adjustment process. Okay, next, part B. With reference to data, right, you can talk about why there was a change in the budget in the time period that's stated in the question. Okay, it's a 2-mark question. So the 2 marks, one, you must tell me that there was a budget surplus, then it became a budget deficit that was worsening. That's 1 mark. Okay, then the second mark is the reason. You just give me one possible reason that would do, right? The possible reason can be that the government had to spend money on stimulus, which is to increase in G, which worsens the budget position. Because budget position is government revenue minus government expenditure, right? Then you either that or you can say that when you have negative GDP growth, which was mentioned in the extracts, right? You have collected less tax. Less tax collections means tax revenue will fall, worsening the budget position. Okay, C was something that we've actually actively covered in the last 1 or 2 months before the A-levels itself, right? With students asking me this specific question during class. Right, with reference to extract 2, why nominal rate of interest of 0.25% will be described as being negative in real terms. Okay, very simple. Real interest rate is nominal interest rate minus inflation rate. So you take inflation rate 2.2%, right? And then your real interest rate will be 0.25% minus 2.2%, which will give you a real interest rate of negative 1.95%. Okay, part D. If you have a negative interest rate, how will it affect savings by consumers as well as the exchange rate? Now, when you have a negative interest rate, it will discourage savings because consumers don't want to put their money in the bank. They rather spend, right? Because putting money in the bank doesn't get you any money, right? So savings by consumers will thus fall, right? That is one side of the answer. The other side of answer, you got to talk about the exchange rate. For exchange rate, I think 2 answers come to my mind that are relatively acceptable. Right, first, if you have negative interest rate, your interest rates are poorer than other countries. That will lead to hot money outflow. Hot money outflow will lead to increased supply of the Australian dollar on the foreign exchange market, which will lead to a depreciation. Okay, or you can say that if consumers were increasing spending because they were saving less, they will also be spending more on imported goods. Then you're supplying more Australian dollars to buy imported goods, which will also lead to depreciation of the Australian dollar. Okay, next, if your Sing dollar is weakening, then will a stronger exchange rate be of benefit to Singapore if the condition being the global economy is in deep recession? Is an 8-mark question. I split to 3 parts. I talk about why, right? What will happen if Sing dollar weakens? Then what would stronger Sing dollar do? Then if the economy is in global recession, which is actually better? Okay, so the first 2 parts, very straightforward. If you have weakening Sing dollar, exports become cheaper, X-M rise, AD rise, real national income rise, you have higher growth, lower unemployment, and improvement in balance of trade. Okay, if you have stronger Sing dollar, you talk about how it addresses inflation by reducing imported cost push and demand pull inflation. Okay, then the last one, which will answer the question, right, is weakening or strengthening better if your global economy is in deep recession? Hey, we must take note that, first of all, Singapore import most of our inputs and raw materials to produce our exports. So even if the weakening of the currency will boost our export competitiveness, it will immediately also cause imported raw materials to become more expensive. So your exporters will find cost of production going up, which negates the positive impacts to the exporter from a depreciation. And then the next point is that if your economy is in deep recession, we are not expecting significant sources of inflation. So if you don't expect inflation to be present, right, then stronger Sing dollar is supposed to address inflation is useless. Okay, if the global economy is in deep recession and you make your Sing dollar stronger, that does you no good because it makes your exports less competitive in a really very threatening environment. So it worsens the impact that global recession could have on SG. Right, that is also why Singapore actually prefers usually, and we carry out a 0% appreciation of the Sing dollar as opposed to whether to weaken and strengthen, right, in times of a global recession. Okay, that brings us to the last question. So fiscal policy is the best way to bring down unemployment in Australia. Okay, so we point out that in the case of pandemic, right, how fiscal policy could address unemployment that is actually largely cyclical in nature, which you can spend time to elaborate on expansive fiscal policy. This is your theory work. Okay, you should be able to do this quite with ease. Okay, the difficult part is to explain why fiscal policy is not so ideal, right? I think I'll write these few points. Number one, Australia has very high debt. If you spend more or you cut taxes, your debt level go up. There's more interest repayments that you're going to make in the future. Number two, right, if you have high debt levels, you can also lead to crowding out effect. You can take time to explain a bit on the crowding out effect. The point 3 is that if in the case of pandemic, you increase government spending, right, it doesn't help you for certain sectors. Like aviation and tourism is because of border closures. So your government spending, right, may not actually stimulate recovery of such sectors. Like it's not as if like you spend more on the sector, suddenly your tourists are going to start coming back. They can't come back. Your border is closed, right? So that's a problem with this fiscal policy, why it might not be so ideal. Then you got to consider alternative policies because it's Denmark. They ask you, is it the most effective way? You say, no, it's not so effective. Then you got to bring in other policies like expansionary monetary policy as alternative. Right, you elaborate on expansionary monetary policy, then you point out that interest rates are already kind of at a record low. Right, so you have very little room to accommodate more interest rate cuts before you start experiencing what I call a liquidity trap. You can explain a little bit more what a liquidity trap is. Okay, right, so that is the answer for the first case study. We move on now to the second case study, right, which I thought was a very, very interesting and slightly difficult case study. Okay, distinguish between a rise in total output and a rise in productivity. Yeah, your productivity, right? Again, this is a definition actually we covered in one of our recent lessons before the A level, the last 1-2 months. We talked about productivity being an increase in output per unit input, right? So rise in total output is just your production overall increasing. Okay, B, why if you have already market power and you already have a lot of profit, you want to spend on a lot of R&D, just take note, it's 2 marks. Don't overdo it. And they only ask you for one reason. I give you 2 reasons, you choose one. Reason number 1, you are in a contestable market. If you choose to be complacent, you don't innovate, you'll come out with something new, your existing small firms or your potential new entrants can overtake the knowledge and the technology that you have, right? Overtake what you have, right? So in a contestable market, they will do so, right? And reason number 2 is that you point out that firms want to maximize profits. And to maintain long-run profits being high, right, you want to actually keep your barriers to entry high. How to keep barriers to entry high? To spend money on R&D, right? You can come out with new technology, you can come out with new products, and you can continue to have new patents that actually keep the barriers to entry high. So this is the answer for part B. Right, C, they're asking you what's the opportunity cost of this money, these billions of dollars spent by the Singapore government to build the country into a global R&D hub. Again, it's 2 marks, don't overdo it. So the opportunity cost, right, you can say that you could have used this money on other infrastructure projects like healthcare, building schools, building transport. Or you can talk a little bit about how, we could have left this money in the reserves. These reserves, actually we invest it for returns, and these returns allow us to spend more in the future. So we are foregoing that, right, when we spend this $19 billion on building a global R&D hub. Okay, part D. How the creation of innovation culture in Singapore is likely to have benefited the Singapore economy. Whenever you ask you about the economy, you need to think about your 4 macro goals, unemployment, inflation, growth, and balance of trade. So you can link it. Let's just find ways to link innovation culture to these things. And then if you have 3 major points, you'll get your 6 marks. Okay, right? And it's explained, it's not like 2-sided kind of answer. So don't try to be funny and then come up with a 2-sided answer. Right? So you don't say, no, you will not have benefited. So don't do that. That's not relevant to the question. So for me, I just explain the basics, right? You could have more than this. So attract FDI, I goes up because you're more innovative. You attract FDI, I goes up, AD goes up, real national income goes up, higher economic growth. Firms hire more factor inputs like labor. You have fall in cyclical unemployment. Okay, then if you have innovation culture, right? You have workers that are more innovative. They produce more, right? Using more creative methods. The productive capacity of Singapore will go up. RAS shift, right? Higher potential growth, which also lowers the general price level and therefore inflation. If you have process innovation, right, which leads to lower production costs, our exports also can become more competitive. Then you talk about what happens when X minus M increase and how it improves balance of trade as well. Okay, part E, it's not very, very difficult, right? But you do need to get a few things right, okay? So discuss whether subsidizing the purchase of electric cars will improve the efficiency of resource allocation in the market for transport in Singapore. Right, we did cover this actually in the mock exam number 2. Right, so if you look at this, so the current market for transport, right, is largely dominated by petrol diesel based cars, which generate significant amount of externalities, right? The extract 5, right? You can use extract 5 to talk about nitrogen oxides, which you link to heart and lung diseases. So third parties suffer health consequences from inhaling gases, right, emitted by petrol and diesel cars. Okay, so when so you give a bit of brief explanation of the negative externality problem, and that leads to overconsumption. Then you talk about what subsidy do. Subsidy lowers cost of production for electric cars, so electric cars will become cheaper. Okay, but electric cars are substitutes for petrol and diesel cars. So if electric cars become cheaper, demand for petrol and diesel cars will fall. The demand for petrol and diesel cars fall, output for petrol and diesel cars will fall. So you now move closer to QS. Okay, right. So but does this actually improve on the efficiency of resource allocation? Right, it depends on the close consideration of the following. You consider these following things. Right, how is electricity produced in Singapore? We produce electricity at power stations which are generated using fossil fuels. So we're going to ask this question: are emissions significantly less, right? Just because they're produced at power stations, as compared to petrol diesel cars. The other thing that we need to consider is actually electric cars and petrol cars, they contribute to congestion in the same way, which are also negative externalities that you need to take into consideration of, right? So would that make your congestion likely worse or not, right? Or status quo? Okay, that's answer for part E. Okay, then part F, right, discuss the extent to which government policy can influence a country's comparative advantage in a good or service, right? If you studied dynamic comparative advantage, like what I told you to, right, in the predictions, you have gotten these full 10 marks. Okay, so you start first by defining what is comparative advantage. Then you point out, okay, a few things like how government policy can change a country's CA in a good. So once you define comparative advantage, then it becomes simple because you know that comparative advantage is about opportunity cost. So how can government policy influence a country's comparative advantage is how does the country changes the country's opportunity cost associated with the production of a good. Like you give maybe one or two examples, preferably two. So you say, like, for example, if you use supply side policies, you invest in education and training, labor force become more skilled, more educated, wages go up. But when your wages go up, your country actually loses CA in labor intensive goods. And then, but conversely, you also gain CA in production of goods that are more knowledge based. Then you give examples, right? So, and if you create capital and business friendly environment, which is what the extract was really kind of talking about, the whole extract 7, that was what I was talking about. So, if you attract FDI and attract high capital intensive firms to set up shop, right? Like for example in Singapore, if you have available machinery, equipment, skills that provide an FDI, then you lower the opportunity cost associated with production of capital intensive or knowledge intensive goods, which will influence again a country's CA. So yes, government policy can influence a country's CA in a good, right? How other factors, because the question was discuss the extent to which government policy can influence the government country's competitive advantage. So we will say that, no lah, government policy it influences to up to a certain level, right? Comparative advantage can still be determined by other factors, right? So like demographic factors, right? Like there's high birth rate in China a couple of decades ago, right? There's a population boom, so more supply of labor, low opportunity costs associated with labor intensive goods. Then your natural factor endowment would also affect your country's CA. And if other countries were developing a CA in the good, but you were remaining stagnant, then it will erode away your country's CA, so you will lose CA even if you did nothing. It could be other countries gaining CA in a part because CA is relative to another country. So actions by other countries can also affect CA. Now, I know some people might have discussed protectionism. If you brought those things in a reasonable way, right, that could also fit into one of these points here. Okay, right, so that's it for the discussion of these two case study questions. Now, for our ETG J2 students, right, if you're watching this now, right, remember to check out the ETG J2 Telegram channel for what I think will come out for paper 2. Okay, right, so that's all for today. All the best for paper 2. Bye bye.